Okay, so let's get started. So everyone, thanks for joining us today. Oh, there she is. Perfect timing. Chi just joined. So thanks for joining us today. My name is Zach Brooks from UGenome. The panel we're doing today is called Equity, Access and Interoperability in Genomic Trials, Emerging Clinical Community Genomic Data for Inclusive Trial Design. We have 4 companies represented, and the people in those companies are going to introduce themselves here shortly. So one is True People Consulting. So Chi, The Beautiful Way, Tamika, Jeeva Clinical Trials, Harsha, UGenome. I'm representing UGenome as the host for today's panel. We have a lot of UGenome people tuning in as well. So thank you, all UGenome people. So let's get started. So in the chat, just to kind of get people warmed up, put in what is your background, pharma, CRO, tech, site, etc. If you don't know, right? I don't know, which is totally fine. Where you're joining us from, one thing you hope to learn from this lesson. Of the following topics, which one do you think you'd learn the most from today? And then finally, just because it's topical, do you prefer the Dodgers or Blue Jays? If you don't know what that is, you can say, I have no idea what you're talking about. So about 2 minutes to kind of participate and add some things to the chat. And Sophie, I don't see the chat, so you can kind of monitor that for us. So another 90 seconds or so, and then we'll launch into the really fun conversation here we're going to have. Great. So let's start thin in earnest. So thanks everyone who's joined us. So let's meet the panelists. So first of all, I'm Zach Brooks, founder and CEO of UGenome. Harsh, if you want to say a word or two, and then we'll say a little bit more later.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zach and Sophie, for this wonderful opportunity. I'm Harsha Rajasimha, founder and CEO of Jeeva Clinical Trials, joining in from Washington, D.C. area. My background is I'm a PhD in genomics and computational biology, coming from a computer science engineering background. So truly interdisciplinary, I would say, over the last 25 years of my career, including postdoctoral training at the National Cancer Institute, Eye Institute, and FDA, before I turned into a social entrepreneur in 2012. As I also turned into a rare dad and a patient advocate. So been wearing multiple hats, but with empathy, trying to understand everyone else's perspective in this complex ecosystem so we can have a more equitable a common ground to make it more inclusive, accessible, affordable, and accelerate the speed of drug development, especially in this era of genomic medicine. So I'm looking forward to learning more about how we engage the community better. And we as scientists need to learn to talk to common people and the community that we are trying to help, and in the language that resonates with them, and build trust. So I'm looking forward to learning that from my fellow speakers.
Nice. Tamika, your turn.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Zach, and the UGenome team. I'm Tamika Jackson, founder and CEO of the Beautiful Way Foundation. We are here based in Boston, Massachusetts, really focusing on the underrepresented and the underserved. And I've been in the industry for over 25 years in pharma R&D and regulatory and clinical operations. So I'm excited to talk about the industry and community connection, and I look forward to having a very lively discussion.
Good. And Chi, thanks for joining. Sorry, it looks like it accidentally asked you to leave. It wasn't intentional at all. So thanks for rejoining.
You're on mute, by the way.
No problem at all. Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Chi Enware, and I'm a consultant with True People Consulting. And we're a strategic agency that really focuses on culture and changing the way that we view work culture. I come with a background in epidemiology and data sciences, really ranging around and finding creative ways to include the community in the narrative, and also including creative ways to collect data and to be able to use that data to translate to policy changes and to have some fun conversations like we're having today. It's a pleasure to be here with you all.
Excellent, thank you. So we've set up some priming slides to kind of orient all of us together on what we're going to be talking about, a little bit of factual information as well. So Digital health equity. So it is the fair and just opportunity for everyone to achieve their full health potential enabled by digital tools. Those digital tools themselves can be problematic as well, but that's a nice sort of starting point. So why digital health equity matters. So remote care does not equal accessible care. The shift to digital often mirrors structural inequities. So think about AI. If AI is based on the data that goes into the tool and that data itself is skewed, then you're going to have some skewed outcomes, maybe inequitable outcomes. Unequal benefits, populations with high needs are often the least served, not a good thing. Exclusion from mistrust in data leads to biased data sets, poor predictive performance, and lower quality care. Equity does not emerge automatically from innovation. It must be intentionally designed. And I think this is probably the best and greatest takeaway from this slide is that, when we think about building great innovative tools, we need to think about, the broad range of people that we're trying to serve with the tools. And if we start with a sense of inclusiveness, then we can get a better tool for everyone at the outset and not have to try to correct things a little bit later on. So that's primer tool or primer slide number one. Number two, framework for digital health equity. So digital health equity requires that all individuals can access, use, and benefit from digital tools without widening disparities. So think about just getting access to a phone and Wi-Fi. And when you don't have Wi-Fi yourself, so suddenly you are disconnected from the world. So I think everyone can identify with that. If you don't have access all the time, you're certainly in a very different position. Emerging frameworks emphasize 5 intersecting components: access, technology usability, digital literacy enablement, community trust and governance, and policy and structural support. So that's the second priming slide, and Sophie, thanks for putting these together. And the next one is digital determinants of health, DDOH. The digital determinants of health lens recognizes that digital forces such as social determinants shape health outcomes, with all the things about digital that is wonderful and that can be inequitable. So examples of DDOH include digital access, device affordability, broadband deserts, adoption and literacy, low confidence navigating portals, apps, data and algorithmic bias, underrepresentation leads to inaccurate risk stratification, power and governance, who owns the data, who decides its use. So a lot of like big structural things we have to think about when it comes to anything that's equity or not. When digital systems fail to include diverse populations, inequity scales faster. And that, I think, is a really nice cautionary sort of pause that we can all take as we enter into today's conversation. So the topics are data interoperability, transparency, and data governance, industry community engagement models that Tamiko is kind of introducing already, with some case studies and examples. So with that, and I forget who we said is going to start with this, and I think it was going to be Harsha. So genomic trials often struggle to merge EHR, lab, and community reported outcomes in ways that meaningfully reflect patients' lived experiences. So I'll start with Harsha for now. From your perspective, what are the biggest barriers to interoperability across these data systems, and what opportunities exist to make that data more actionable and equitable?
Yeah, thank you, Zach. Happy to kick us off on this interesting conversation. Uh, I- in my view, often interoperability comes as an afterthought on once we have some data collected for various different purposes, more as at an enterprise data integration, data interoperability scale, where often the first place to start is asking the question, why do we need all of these different but connected and related data sets, right? From the electronic medical records, whether genomic or multi-omic data coming from next generation DNA sequencing technologies, and the community reported outcomes. So I think it's important to define what each of these data sets are, especially as we seek to engage the community on what are these acronyms and what does this data actually mean, and towards what end are we actually capturing all of this data. And so explaining this in layman terms becomes very important. And so the electronic health record or medical records come from our, obviously, the clinical data captured by physicians, nurses, and the healthcare professionals. And the genomic is relatively new, but now quite commonplace with, especially at least in the United States and certain countries, with next generation DNA sequencing derived data. And so what that tells is when we think about uh, environment, lifestyle, and genetics, right? So that's the three aspects we are looking at. So when we look at EHR, we are looking at what are the symptoms, what are the diagnoses, what medications the patient or individual is taking. That's the coming from the electronic medical records. And from genomics, we are looking at the DNA mutations or sometimes polymorphisms, as we call them, which is just what makes us unique, each one of us, right? So it's the same 23 pairs of chromosomes every human carries, but there are some very small 0.1% difference in the DNA sequence that makes us who we are, with our skin tone, the height, and the weight, and the brain. That's so unique. And then the community reported is lifestyle experiences, right? So the weather, the environmental factors, and other things that impact human behavior in different parts of the world or in the country. And so having access to all three types of data makes it integrative analysis easier if we know what questions we are trying to answer, whether it's from clinician or researcher perspective. And so I think having a solid understanding of the intended use cases as to what questions we are trying to answer, defining them upfront is the biggest barrier, because often we want to answer a number of different questions. And so keeping it open-ended, we can't be all end all, for everything. And so having a specific focus is the biggest barrier, I would say.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the way you were responding, what I was thinking is, on the surface, you think, well, let's just make this data work together better. But you were talking about three large phenomenon. I mean, medical records, DNA, and so forth, and then community experiences and so forth. So you're putting all these things together. That by itself, those phenomena, plural, is going to be automatically a challenge, from data interoperability. It's not just a data kind of issue and problem. And like you said, one of the ways to solve for that is to know the questions you want to answer in advance. So yeah, thanks, Harsha. Let's get to the next question. And so if you have any questions, by the way, share them in the chat, and Sophie will look after them and we'll thread them in a little bit later. So the next one is, the background for this is, as health data becomes increasingly shared across platforms, transparency and consent become ethical cornerstones and really important things to consider. So Tamika, I think you can jump on this one. How can the industry build governance models that balance innovation with trust, especially in communities that have historically experienced data exploitation or neglect?
Well, what's interesting enough is when you're talking about data and you're talking about going into a community that does not trust the industry, you start with transparency. And the importance of that is making sure that you're coming with the understanding of what your intent is and ensuring that you have the methodology in place to be able to not only take data, but give back to the community what they need in order to build that trust. And as we do this across these platforms, it's important to understand that, to acknowledge the historical issues that we've had in this area. And it's also important to ensure that the models in which we are putting together is something that we can sustain across a particular corporation. One of the things that we are interested in doing is understanding the community engagement model, putting that first, not talking to the industry, to the community from the industry's perspective, but meeting a particular community where they are. And what we want to do is take that information that we're learning to give back to that community, to open up the trust, to build that trust. This is a long-term relationship. This is not something that we can go, it's a hit or quit type of relationship. We have to be in that community consistently. And the reason why the governance models are so important is because it's the standard in which we are developing to be able to not only have within our own organizations, but to share across the industry to ensure ensure that these models are going to be able to be consistent. Because if company A has a ethical, moral approach and transparent approach, and then company B comes in to that same community, all of the hard work that has just been built is now wiped out because another company was not equipped with the knowledge and the educational information, the model that works effectively. So what we're looking at, and from our perspective, is we are looking to understand how can we ensure that the data that is collected meets the ethical standards that we believe works, and how could we hold organizations accountable, ensuring that they are also coming in and having that same level of standardization. Governance models are going to be the way in which we do that. We have to share what we've learned, what works well, what does not work well, and then we have to translate that information into the standards from the community, making sure that the community stakeholders are aware of what we learn and being able to feed back into their model to help them understand how they can improve. We have to do that for the industry to ensure that they have the same information to be able to be effective, because we're working together, we're representing life sciences. And then we have to make sure that policies are updated to be able to have that long-term impact to make sure that these are successful.
Yeah, thanks, Tamika. I'm reminded, Harsha, you can correct me, but yesterday you captured something really well in our preparation meeting, is that healthcare moves at the speed of trust. I think, is that what you said,
Yeah,
Harsha?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so-
And yeah, no, I think trust is fundamental and sits a layer above transparency and data governance in that, and that informed consent that you have on the screen becomes quite critical on the challenge is we don't want to burden the individual, whether healthy or patient, to have to consent every single time that we want to go back and consent for, oh, we want to use your data for this
Right.
particular purpose and scenario and use case. And so minimizing burden while maintaining transparency. And in an era where a lot of the data integration, analytics, visualization, and data sharing is happening between machines with
Right.
artificial intelligence and federated systems on a global scale, implementing, maintaining transparency and data governance without reducing burden on, without increasing burden on patients and individuals to reconsent again and again, and that slows down innovation as well. But doing all this while ensuring trust is maintained is the critical aspect. And so too much detail can burn out the individual. They may not necessarily be as interested in understanding all the nitty-gritty details, but at the same time, transparency is also a balancing act. How much detail is too much? That may vary from individual to individual, but it's also from a regulatory perspective, having the ethics committees, the institutional review boards, and even in regulated environments such as clinical trials, we need to maintain audit logs of what data was shared at what time, between whom, for what purpose, for what duration, and so that when an inspection happens for good cause by the regulators, all of that information is traceable and verifiable, so that and ensuring that this is done in a accordance to a governance rule,
Right.
helps build and maintain that trust.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that what I would say is that model is already in place per se, traditionally by pharma, but I think how it converts and how it translates over to the community is where we lack. And the guidance and governance around that process is what we need to take back and add to the standards of the industry. So we have it down from the industry's perspective. We've changed a lot since some of these historical issues have happened with these communities in the industry. But the industry is unaware, and they're not clear on how much we've changed. And so now we have to translate that change and become transparent. And that is where I think we lack.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to the next question. Again, if you have any questions in the chat, Go ahead, Chi-Chi, this is going to be for you. So the background on this prompt is partnerships between sponsors, CROs, community organizations often define whether a trial is a success or not. And this is kind of what Tamika was getting at. So the question for you, Chi-Chi, is what does an authentic engagement model look like in practice? One that ensures community insight directly shapes study design, recruitment, and feedback loops.
Thank you. So for me, this question really resonates because it really talks about the crux of research design. And I think when we discuss industry relationships with communities, one of the key ways to be able to engage the community is by co-designing with the community and seeing the community not only as co-designers, but they're also co-decision makers, and they're also able to interpret this work for us in a different way that we wouldn't necessarily see it, especially coming from a scientific or industry standpoint. First, it's really important to engage the community from the beginning because a lot of times when we're engaging in this work, we're not really aware of the population that we're trying to reach. We have an idea of the population, but especially when we're discussing rare diseases, the numbers can be very minuscule. But the key to that is also identifying key community members or key individuals in that community that might be impacted or might have an understanding. And so engaging the community and engaging maybe community advisory boards and seeing them not as advisors but co-creators. So
Right.
from the research question, the success metrics, the language that's being used for recruitment, the data collection tools have to resonate with the community. A lot of the times our industry, we come into these communities and we expect that they understand what we're saying, and we are not understanding them from a cultural perspective. We need to have a culturally rooted approach to be able to engage community-based organizations, but then also a community-based approach to engage key stakeholders in those communities. And those key stakeholders can not only be your community-based organizations, but also practitioners, faith networks, barbershop networks, doula networks, your local hair salon, utilizing the community in a different way and seeing them as co-creators in this work. So when you're including the community from the beginning, you actually impact the governance of that work because now you're including the community in the decision making. They're co-governors in this work, so they're also going to advocate for this work just as intently and intentionally as we would, because we've included them from the beginning. So really being able to see an engagement model in process and in practice involves utilizing the community from the beginning. And so if you can identify one or two individuals in that community that are the spearheads or the ones that everyone comes to for advice, you can even utilize as simple as the grandma at the end of the street that is everyone's babysitter from the very young age. That is someone who is a key member of the community. That is someone that has access to members of the community from a very young age to a very older age because they're interacting with the parents. And so when we're thinking of rare disease and we're thinking of the industry and how we need to collect different types of data, it's really important to look at the community from the inside out as opposed from a microscopic lens.
Got it. Thank you, Chi-Chi. Let's go to the next kind of set of questions in the interest of time. If there's any questions that have popped up, we can get to those too here shortly. So we'll go now to a kind of a case study, and this is going to be open-ended for everyone. But one of the case studies the group talked about, the panelists talked about, is sickle cell versus cystic fibrosis. So sickle cell and cystic fibrosis both began as rare disease challenges, yet one has historically been underfunded and underrepresented, while the other has had sustained investment and policy support. And you can kind of see the metrics on the screen. We'll leave this up so you can look at it some more. I did a quick calculation ahead of time. And so per person basis, the sickle cell is about 2,000 per person. The cystic fibrosis, taking the 400 million mark, is at about $10,000 per patient. Right there already represents, some differences. And let's say those differences aren't good. So maybe Chi-Chi, we'll have you start this time. So what can we learn from comparing these two models about how data advocacy and equity intersect in genomics? And we'll go backwards. So 2 minutes for you, Chi-Chi, Tamika, and then Harsha.
Thank you. So I would say when it comes to comparing the two models, I think it's important to look at what is considered popular and what is also considered, what is not considered the most frequent or the most known illness. And I think that's what we see in the difference with sickle cell and cystic fibrosis, in that there is one disease that seems to have more notoriety than the other. But I think it's important to use them interchange, to use what's working for one to advocate for the data collection of the other. I think it's important to see that if certain diseases or certain illnesses are similar, they don't have to necessarily be the blueprint, but they can be an example for advocacy. So when we're advocating for more funding, or we're advocating for more attention or access to clinical trials, we can definitely use a sister illness or an element that is very similar to advocate for why something as rare as cystic fibrosis can receive just as much attention as sickle cell anemia.
Yeah, thank you. Tamika, what are your kind of thoughts and response on this?
Well, from just looking at the data, it's a little bit disheartening to see the funding, how it's so much more increased for cystic fibrosis versus sickle cell, and especially in the U.S. prevalence rates that we are seeing, where the diseases are occurring. And so I think, in addition to that, I always think about, how do you relate to something that you can't understand if when you're making the decision. And so when we go in to look at who's making these decisions, I think that that is something that needs to be considered. And it's not a knock on anyone, because you don't know what you don't know. And so when these decisions are being made, I think there's a lot of data points that we could talk that we're probably missing that we would need to consider. But when you think about the fact that the primary population for cystic fibrosis is about 95% white or of European descent, while the primary population for sickle cell disease is about 90% Black or African descent. So I think that speaks volumes, and yet the prevalence is so much, is more than double for the folks that are taking that we're getting the funding for. And so I think what we need to see is that culturally, even the decision makers, it matters at the decision makers level, because I believe that there's something missing here, why those numbers are so different. I mean, 150 million at least, it starts off more, right? And so that was just what jumped out at me first. And I really would love to kind of dig into this case. And as a matter of fact, TBW will take this on and try to and understand a little bit more about this and other, funding issues that we are finding, that the disparity in funding. So that's interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And Harsha.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting data and reactions, right? Like we come obviously from different lenses and different perspectives, but having been part of the NIH umbrella for a few years, and knowing how funding decisions get allocated at a very high level, right? So they are not looking at, okay, the decision makers are not looking at this data. It's not a single decision maker who is going to look at this data and decide, okay, I'm going to put more money here and less money here.
Right.
It just doesn't work like that, right? And so what happens is cystic fibrosis, for various reasons, has become a greatest success story in the history of rare diseases, right? Both are rare diseases. However, from a patient advocacy point of view, and from driving and pushing the funding investments, driving the science, getting towards that first approved treatment by Vertex Pharma, I think in 2014, or Kambi, that was a massive success story. And it was done in a way that the patient advocacy group, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, had a skin in the game. The patient group had a skin in the game, and they benefited with more than $1 billion in royalties that was received as a result of the approved treatment itself. Now, no other rare disease patient advocacy group has been able to replicate what Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was able to accomplish. And so what that tells us is we can't just sit back and relax and as a patient community or as a specific affected citizen and a caring citizen, we can't sit back and relax. If we do the right advocacy efforts, make sure our voices are heard at the Senate and US Congress level, but also at the NIH level, at the executive branches, and to the industry, and making sure our, cystic fibrosis, I remember even as a graduate student, a poor Indian graduate student at Virginia Tech, I would receive a mail from Cystic Fibrosis Foundation asking for donations in the mailbox very frequently. And I was not in a position to donate back then, but what struck in my mind is out of 11,000 rare diseases, I could barely remember a few names, and cystic fibrosis was one of them. And so there is no replacement for hard work, advocacy, sincerity, and showing up and advocating for the needs of the community, whoever needs it. So I would say it's in the group. Kudos to the group that led the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation over the years. And I'm sure sickle cell disease also has numerous advocacy groups doing their bit, but I think there might be some lessons to learn from each other.
But the numbers don't lie, right? So I think when we compare what you're saying is I absolutely understand. But what we're seeing here is the numbers don't lie. And so even if the barrier is what you just said, Harsha, if the barrier was we need to do better with sickle cell in our foundations and being able to champion that effort, then that's the message that we want to take back. We need to understand, though, this is what I'm saying, is that this is kind of rings out to me that there's something not right here, right? That we're not getting. And so from a cultural perspective, we can go, like I said, there's sickle cell patients that can go to the doctor and tell them how much pain they're in, and it's not believed. And so so it could be a champion of the foundation, which I don't doubt. That sounds very powerful, what they did. But it also can be you don't know what you don't know, and therefore you can't understand it. And so I want to understand more about that, because here are the numbers, and the funding is it's just different, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
And I think something else that's coming up is that there is that staunch reality that when there has been historical barriers in place that prevent individuals from understanding the pain levels of those that are from African descent or Black descent. And I think when we really understand the barriers that impact individuals of African descent or African American descent less likely to be listened to, I think that's important to keep that in mind as we're looking at these numbers, because that also is a telling sign that there is an understanding in the population. So, for instance, we're looking at a population of about 100,000 individuals. So then what is the issue? And going back to what Tamika said is you don't know what you don't know, but then there are things that we do know. And there are things that we know, which is that when there is a particular population, the levels of pain are not taken as seriously. The inclusion of those communities in the production of drugs or remedies for these diseases are not included. And so we can say within the last 2 years, there were 2 sickle cell drugs, gene therapy drugs that were approved. And I was happy to be in part of some of the conversations around that with legislation. And I think one of the key issues that came up was how come if the most affected population were not included primarily in these clinical trials, and why weren't these individuals primarily used as the key stakeholders in this work? And I think when we go back to a lot of these companies, I think the understanding really comes down to what are those historical factors that are preventing industry from going into these communities and understanding what the issues are, and that in turn can allow them to get the funding that they need.
Right.
For me, like I come from a, transplant background. And so one of the things that stood out, I forget who said it, maybe this was Tamika or maybe this was Chichi, use one of these to advocate for the others. So in the world of like transplantation, there's different people that get transplantation transplantation for different reasons. So, liver, kidney, heart, and so forth. And within that community, they all advocate for each other to get better transplantation. But of course, within that community, heart recipients will say, well, you guys don't understand what it's like to have a heart, because the way we can exercise is very, very different than someone who has a kidney. And the kidney will say, well, yeah, but it's very different if you have a liver transplant, because that you have a different regime of medications than other people will point to if you have bone marrow transplant. And after they get through this massive 1 year kind of process, they're not on any medications whatsoever. So I think that model is actually good here as well, that there's a similar, greater advocacy, and there's some distinctions underneath that. So that's kind of what I'm reminded of during this conversation. So let's get to the next slides. Thanks guys for that great conversation. If there's any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll thread you in. Yeah, and then there you go. On cue, reminder, if you have any questions, put them in. So we'll go to a lightning round. This is sort of a minute per person and everyone can jump in. Here's the 3 questions. And in this time, we'll have Tamika go first, and then Harsha, and then Chi-Chi. So then I'll just read the questions and you choose the question you want to answer. So biggest misconception about equity in clinical trials today, hardest truth we need to confront to make progress, and 1 pro and 1 con of how the industry currently approaches inclusion. So Tamika, you go first and you can answer whichever question you like.
Let me think. So I don't have to answer all 3.
Nope.
Okay. Hardest truth we need to confront to make progress. I think the hardest truth is that we're so focused on the data and the science that we are forgetting the people in which we're serving. I think what happened is that the data, the timelines, the budgets, the resources, milestones, all of these things are very important for a for-profit business. You cannot not focus on those things. And I support that, but who you serve should never be forgotten. And if your organization can't do that internally, then you must partner with the organizations that can keep you connected to the people that you serve. I'm not sure of a lot of other industries who does such important work that this should happen in, because we do some of the most important work. We provide therapeutics to treat conditions, and that is a life or death situation that we're in. And so to take the brain, which is our data, the information, and disconnect it from the heart, which is the communities in which we serve, is a deadly outcome. And so we need to think about how can we make sure that truth, but we connect those 2 pieces, those 2 important components back together again. That is what I believe.
Great, thanks, Tamika. Harsha, you can choose the same question or a different one.
Are you on mute?
I'll take a quick stab at all 3. The misconception is somebody else is going to ensure equity in clinical trials today, right? Nobody is. It's in your hands. You need to step up. You need to make sure your voice is heard, get involved, and you be the master of your destiny, right? So don't expect government will do it or somebody else will do it.
Right.
I would say that's the biggest misconception. Second, the hardest truth is 90% of clinical trials are conducted in 5% of the countries. And FDA is a national organization, not a global organization. It's a national agency loyal to the US Constitution and US federal government. It's not a global agency, although there is only one FDA in the entire world. And drugs approved by the FDA are used by everybody eventually whenever they are commercialized in low and middle income countries. But otherwise, the truth is FDA is doing what's right for United States only first. And if it also helps humanity, it's great, right? And so that's the harder truth we need to confront to make progress. And so other countries are collaborating with FDA, and they, even though they lack new drug development capabilities in many other countries, they can collaborate and work with the FDA to ensure drugs being developed for United States can also be made affordable and accessible in other parts of the world. One pro of the way industry operates is launch in the US, the biggest market in the world, then European Union, then Japan, and then there is a long tail before drugs are made available in Asia, Latin America, and finally Africa, right? And so that whole the pro of that for the industry is it's good economics, but the con is they are missing who the patient they are looking to service. The definition of a patient is not bounded by any geography. And so the patients are everywhere, especially for certain diseases like sickle cell. There is 5 million people affected by sickle cell in Africa. And so the con is inequity, right? Inequity in access. When you only focus on from a market commercial potential point of view and continue to operate in that way.
Yeah, thank you. And what I was thinking about number one when you were speaking, Harsha, is don't be a patient. And what I mean by that is sometimes people are patients. They're people who have the title of patient while they're going through a certain process, but then certain people get comfortable with being patients and being taken care of and so forth. And so it's important when you're in those situations yourself or a family member, you advocate for yourself in any way possible. And whatever advocacy you do for yourself is a fine way to do it. It's not you should judge whatever advocacy a mom is trying to do for her son in a certain situation. It's like advocate the best way you can for yourself and worry about apologizing later in the situation of healthcare. So like, don't be a patient. That's kind of what stood out to me. Chi-Chi, your turn.
Sure. I will go with question 3. I think question 1 and 2 are answered greatly. I would say one of the pros within the industry is that we are having this conversation. I think that is one thing that I commend because it hasn't been that way for a long time. We haven't had that conversation of inclusion and equity when it comes to clinical trials or including individuals in the conversation around rare diseases. I would say one of the cons around this is the industry still thinking that they are the experts and not utilizing the actual community experts when trying to approach work around inclusion. I think we have especially when we talk about inoperability, there has to be that understanding that there's clinical, there's community, and then there's actually the researchers. And so we can't really expect the researchers to have the wherewithal to go into the communities and really garner the information that we want. And I'm even speaking from a researcher perspective in that even if I go into certain communities, I can't be the one to ask these questions because I already have that badge on my forehead that says I'm here to do research. And so utilizing members of those communities and saying, this is how you can be a part of this work. And these are ways that we can incentivize that work. There's also the con around thinking that this is free work because you're working with the community. So they'll do it for free because they love their community. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes you have to incentivize. There are barriers to language, there are barriers to transportation, there are barriers to income, and not having incentives in place that we would regularly have for other communities or communities that we would be more comfortable in, we will have incentives for them. So thinking of really democratizing those incentives and ensuring that the communities are utilized in a very holistic and intentional way.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'll just say maybe 2 things before we finish up. Ahead of schedule, which is not a bad thing at all, is one is that, preparing for this, one of the things that stood out, I learned a new academic concept is called intervention generated inequality. So as we're building these new technologies, sometimes we're also unintentionally, I would say, creating some intervention generated inequalities. And so that's why I think Tamika's point's a really good one. Like, let's make sure we have the people focus in all of what we're doing. And I think everyone said that in some way. So I think that would be one thing to kind of keep in mind. And the other thing, I'll just give a shout out to University of Maryland. Sophie knows about this as well, that has a really good program. I forget the name, but it's something like Patients. Do you remember, Sophie, the exact name of this University of Maryland program? It's called Patients Academy. So a
Yes,
lot of what they're talking
the Patients Professors Academy.
Patients Professors Academy. University of Maryland runs it through their pharmacy school. Both Sophie and I ended up taking that. We find that out later. And a lot of what they talk about is how Tamika talks about these things and Harsha talks about these things and Chi-Chi talks about these things. It's like community first, partner with them. And as you partner with them, you come up with better products, better quality of life and better drugs in the end of the day, designed for the people they're supposed to work with. So anyway, those are my final thoughts. Thanks everyone for joining. Didn't see any questions today, but I guess the panelists did such a great job that we can finish up. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Too.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.